Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all very well this morning. I'm going to speak a little bit this morning about the stories we tell about ourselves, about history, about what is history and how do we understand it, whether we're talking about larger political, societal history or our own personal histories, and how we weave all the different elements of that into our lives. History are those stories that we tell ourselves about our past and what it means and who we are and how we get all sorts of meaning out of that. How we create senses of identity out of the stories of our past. And this is used as part of how we move forward on from events, or how we understand ourselves in more general terms. And it's never a simple thing. There are always competing interpretations and explanations of history, whether those are the personal events in our lives or the larger events in our lives. And we all know that very well from the personal events in our lives when it comes to having very different differences of opinion about what exactly happened in a certain situation. I'm sure we've all been there when someone has had a very different idea of something that's happened from our idea of what happened. Now, this is also important when we look at the Bible and we look at Jesus and his story and how we understand that within larger elements of history and our past, and how we weave that into our own stories. Now, there are loads of ways that Jesus is described in the Bible, particularly in John's Gospel. He has many titles, many different names, and many different ways in which he's described. And many different ways in which he's described in relation to God. He is the words that was there with God from the beginning, and he's also God's son. But these aren't very direct, literal meanings of exactly what God is. He's not words floating about in English or any other language, and he's not directly God's son in the way that I am my Father's son and so forth. It's a way of understanding. And if we look at that, God so loved the world that he gave his only son for us. That is a way of communicating the meaning of who God is and who Jesus is and what happened there when Jesus came down to earth. That's part of God's history. That's part of Jesus' history. And that language is part of a way of communicating what it is that happened there. Because how do we tell the stories of our past, whether it's of our country or of our town or of ourselves? We all have different ways of telling these stories. And I sometimes struggle very much to tell the stories of myself and who I am and how I have got to where I am. Alba this week had to talk in school about one of her parents' job and what they do. They had a working Wednesday. I think it's ridiculous when they ask kids of that kind of age, what do you want to be when you grow up? Give them a little bit of time to figure that out. They're very, very young. But they had to talk about at least one of their parents and what they did as what they do as their job, which for me, it's not the easy thing to describe exactly what it is I do. It's not like going in and saying, hi, I'm Ian, I'm a teacher, or hi, I'm Ian, I'm a minister, or hi, I'm Ian, I'm an accountant, or hi, I'm Ian, I am a football player. There are many different elements that make up that, and I don't feel tied down in terms of identity to that sort of particular job role. So we had different discussions of what Daddy is. What's Daddy's job title? Daddy's job title is quite clearly Daddy Daddington, because That's what I get called around here when it's having some fun time. That's my role a lot of the time, is being a dad. My name is Ian and I'm a dad. I'm also many other things. I'm an academic and I'm a development officer for Noonday, and many other things too. And it's finding that way and balance of telling a story. I have recently learned to drive, and if people inquire why it's taken me to the age of 35 to learn how to drive, I could tell the story in many different ways, and I don't really know what the actual answer is. Probably lots of different elements knitted together. I used to live in a place that was very handy for lots of different buses. I'm naturally quite introverted, and for many different reasons aren't that keen to go out and learn to drive with someone else. Or maybe I'm just a little bit lazy in that regard and didn't want to do it. Although then again, it has led to me walking many places and feeling quite good that I haven't thus far added to the carbon emissions through driving my own car. There are many different ways of telling that story. I mean, I could simply make myself out to be the good guy in terms of nature. Look, I am protecting the nature. I've protected nature up to this point in time by not driving a car. I'm not creating any extra emissions. That's fine. But that wouldn't be the full story. Although I do feel good about that, but that's not the full story. As I said, there's many other elements that go into this. And there's many elements that go into how we tell the story of where we are and what our existence means in terms of the country that we live in and so forth. If we look at some of the debates we've been having recently about statues and who we should have statues of and who we shouldn't have statues of, and as good Christians, I'm sure we'll all agree that we shouldn't have statues because such idolatry is not on whatsoever. Unless Scotland win the Euros and then all the players can have their own statues all lined up outside the Hampden, that'll be okay. My point I'm trying to make there is, let's not take that kind of thing too seriously in terms of who we put literally on a pedestal. But if we look at how we look at ourselves and our stories and what we knit and weave into there, I think it's quite right that people look at a statue of someone like Cecil Rhodes, who had very many controversial views about the superiority of the English race, for example, in terms of their culture and their society and what they could bring to the rest of the world. And having a statue at Oxford University of him, I quite back those who are striking and not in favour of that kind of statue being in place, and going through the proper processes of dealing with that. Because there are ways of saying he was a man of his time, but actually, if you read some other people from that time, he wasn't simply a man of his time. There were always others who would disagree. And there was, very importantly, theologians of that time who held very different views in that regard. And I'll get back to that in a moment. Because we look at stories of who Jesus was and how we tell a story of Jesus, we find someone who was incredibly humble, who didn't care for building himself up in the way of society's rules. He wasn't above going through a process of putting himself to death or being put to death at the hands of his own creation, when he could have done things in a different way. And we look at it in a way of God so loved the world that he gave his son for us. So looking at the identity of Jesus and how we revisit that over and over again, because we're never going to find the perfect explanation. We don't have access to the divine explanation of what happened there. We don't have some access to the language of God. We have access to our own language and the way that we speak. We have to weave that into our lives in a way that we can understand it. So it's okay if it means more to you to weave it in a way that it's more about motherhood than fatherhood. Perhaps fatherhood isn't the easiest concept to grapple with when it comes to God. Perhaps it's easier to put it in another way, and that's okay. It's okay to think about it and have it in language that makes more sense to you. The important point is here that it's about love, that it's about humility and putting yourself in a position where you can show love for others without trying to simply put yourself over and above everyone else. And that's important when it comes to finding our own identities in who we are, especially if we're looking at putting Christ at the centre of this. You know, have you ever thought about how God gave his only son for the world, yet we're also all God's children? Yes, that is just the way language works, isn't it? We're not talking about a literal way that God only had one son, yet he has billions of children. We're all God's sons and daughters. It's a figurative language in a way of understanding what all this means. But what it means is we're all important. We're all special. And we're not all special because we're more special than our neighbours. We're more special than anyone else. We're special because we're all special, and we're all special to God. It doesn't need to be in competition. We're special because God loves us all and wants the best for all of us, and wants us to want the best for everyone around us as well. So there's no pretense of having some sort of superiority over everyone else in terms of our position in relation to God. God wants everyone alike to be special because he views all of us as special. So when we are weaving our identities, we can't say, well, I am somehow better than anyone else. Which doesn't mean that we can't strive to be the best that we can be, and that doesn't mean that we don't act in ways that are better than others. But that doesn't mean that we're somehow more important. It just means that we've managed to get along that right path and following Jesus. And that point is that we're all loved. And you can't be on that right path if you're pushing others off it. You can't be on that right path if you're excluding others from the path. If you've built up an idea of identity in terms of your personal identity, in terms of your national identity, in terms of your political identity, if that identity pushes other people off the path in order for you to continue progress along it, because that's not the path that Jesus is asking us to go along. So in our awareness of the stories that we tell and how we weave them together, we have to have this awareness of who Jesus is and who Jesus wants us to be in terms of following him and his identity. And that means that we always have to interpret and reinterpret what that means in our lives, because we're telling our own stories as we go along, and we're interpreting them as we go along. And it's okay to look back and think, have I been thinking about some things in the wrong way? Do I need to adjust my feelings and thoughts on this? Whether that's about ourselves, about our families, about our communities, about Jesus, about the way we look at the Bible, and which the way we understand the way in which we're living. We weave all these things together in our own narratives, in our own history of our lives. And we use that to push ourselves forward. We are all the historians of our own lives, examining our mistakes and our triumphs and everything in between, and trying to forge a way forward. And when we think about that, we think about the identity of Christ and what that means for us in our lives. So we look at it, we interpret it, we reinterpret it, we try to find the best way out of that. And it's not easy, and it's always a process. And I hope that I've helped you this morning to think about that process and to open up some questions about what it means to you. What does Jesus mean to you? What is the language, looking at the language of the Bible, how does that best apply to your life? What's the best way to describe Jesus and what he means to you, to describe God and what he means to you in the relation to your life, and how best that fits in? How best do we then look back on our lives and about our politics and our nation, and to think about how we bring this through? Culturally, how does Jesus find his way into the history of our lives and into our stories? And how does that best forge the path forward for us? God so loved the world that he gave his only Son for us. There's a real depth to that meaning, to that emphasis of, could you give your own child for the greater good? And what exactly does that mean? It's difficult, but it's figurative language. It's figurative language about love and what love means, and then how we weave that in to our lives with Christ at the centre. So I hope you're all well, and I hope you're all enjoying this lazy Sunday morning, all in your pyjamas, or all very well dressed for church as usual. I don't know. I don't want to imagine it, to be honest. So I hope you're all well, and I hope you all have a good week, and I hope I haven't spoken for too long. Love you all. Goodbye.